Happy to do it. Happy to do it. Yeah. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Carlin Bowman, and I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'd like to welcome all of you and our C-SPAN audience tonight to this lecture by Peter Schuck. With this lecture, we will conclude the 2016-2017 AEI Bradley Lecture Series. We are, as always, grateful to the Lined and Harry Bradley Foundation of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The foundation has supported this lecture series for more than a quarter century. When Peter Schuck emailed me and a few of my AEI colleagues to say that he might be able to give a lecture in Washington about his new book, Nation Undecided, Clear Thinking About 5 Hard Issues That Divide Us, we jumped at the chance. For Peter is, as one of his many academic admirers said, one of the clearest and most thoughtful legal and policy scholars of this or any generation. Peter is the Simeon E. Baldwin Professor Emeritus of Law at Yale. He reminded me that he was an AEI visiting scholar in 1979, the year that Norm Ornstein and I arrived at AEI. He's the author of, among many other books, Why Government Fails So Often and How It Could Do Better, Understanding America, the Institutions and Policies That Shape America and the World, a volume that he co-edited with our longtime AEI colleague, the late James Q. Wilson. And finally, Meditations of a Militant, Moderate, Cool Views on Hot Topics. Tonight, after his lecture, copies of Peter's new book will be available for purchase, and he will sign them in this room. We invite all of you to join us for a reception after the lecture and the question and answer period. One more housekeeping detail. We are going to be taking questions from our audience online today. If you would like to submit a question for consideration, go to slido.com and enter code AEI event. It's very simple. Enter your name, type in your question, and we may choose to read it on stage. Tonight, Peter will discuss 3 of the 5 issues that currently divide us: poverty, immigration, and religious exemptions from secular public policies. He reminds us that we have argued about these issues for so long that their contours are well known. He will give us a sense of what makes these issues hard, why today's hard issues are almost harder by definition, and explain what clear thinking on each one entails. After last week's debacle on healthcare, it is more than clear that we need clear thinking about hard policy issues. I can think of no better guide to the landscape of these issues than Peter Schuck. Please join me in welcoming Pete.
Thank you very much, Carlin, and to the AEI staff, and to you folks who've decided to spend a beautiful late afternoon inside with me. As Carlin said, this is a brand new book, and this is not the first book I've written that AEI has been gracious enough to host a book event for. So I'm very grateful to them for doing that. The title, One Nation Undecided, Clear Thinking About 5 Hard Issues That Divide Us, it's a little cumbersome, but it emphasizes 3 urgent conditions. First, the deep divisions within our society. I don't have to belabor the point. I don't know whether we have ever been as polarized as we are now since the Civil War. It's an extraordinarily difficult time in our political system. The second urgent condition is the need for clear thinking, which is related to the first. By clear thinking, I mean 5 basic elements. First, one's analysis needs to rest on a clear factual record, so the factual information on which we make our decisions or think about these issues is accurate, it's timely, and it's unbiased. Secondly, a clear thinking person analyzes the relevant values. And these issues, one of the aspects of their hardness is that they implicate a number of values, and they're often conflicting values. A third element of clear thinking is that the analyst needs to consider the likely consequences of various policy choices that are under consideration. And that entails a very hard-nosed view, mobilizing whatever social science there is to analyze those consequences, predict those consequences, and follow them where they lead. The fourth element of clear thinking, in my view, is that it identifies relevant distinctions and trade-offs and has those clearly in mind, without blinking the reality of these trade-offs, but taking them seriously and understanding that the trade-offs often reflect conflicting values and also conflicting ways of reading the evidence. And then the fifth element of clear thinking is to prefer the policy options which are most cost-effective and implementable. I would also add that, and I say this in the book, that process matters a lot. And by process, I refer not only to the process of formulating and adopting policy, but also the process for implementing whatever measures are adopted. Now, this is a technocratic way of thinking about policy, if you will. I do not find that a problem. I discuss in the book the moral objections to this technocratic way of thinking, and I reject the objection. And in the Q&A, if you like, I can get into that. Now, this is about clear thinking with respect to hard issues. So I explain in the book what I mean by hard issues, and I analyze 5 of them. What's most important about hard issues is that reasonable people can and do differ with respect to them, though some preferred outcomes, it seems to me, are clearer than others. In general, as I state in the book, I really don't care where people come out on these issues as long as they have thought them through in the manner that I suggest. The major exception to that, I would say, is affirmative action, where I think the evidence is very, very clear that this is a failed policy, a very divisive policy, and really helps no one except the relatively few beneficiaries of affirmative action who are already, by and large, privileged within their group. But I'm not going to discuss affirmative action today. I asked Carlin what you folks would be most interested in. She suggested that I focus on poverty, immigration, and religious exemptions to secular policies. So let me begin with poverty. I should say that I had to submit the manuscript before the Brookings AEI report on poverty came out, but I had access to most of the work that went into that report, and I cite it and use it in my analysis. In the chapter on poverty, I also discuss inequality for a couple of reasons. First, to distinguish it from poverty. The folks in this audience, I suspect, understand that they're two very different things. One being poverty being an absolute level of deprivation, and inequality being a relative concept comparing one group of people to other groups of people. But there is, in the public mind, I think, a lot of confusion about the distinction, and so I analyze inequality and explain some of its measures and trends, and then I turn to poverty itself. So poverty involves a wide range of difficult questions, analytical questions. Obviously, I don't need to say that it involves terrible conditions of life for people who suffer from it. But that only makes more important the need to define it clearly and rigorously. So the first issue is how to define it. The second issue is how to measure it. Let me pause on that. The measurement of poverty has been a much controverted issue from the very outset, the establishment of the Office of Economic Opportunity in 1964. The official poverty measure, which we still use today, has been based on this measure. It was developed by a woman at the Social Security Administration, Molly Orshansky. She recognized at the time that it was a very inadequate measure of poverty, very actually uninformative in most respects. But since then, almost everybody who discusses and analyzes poverty agrees that it's not a good measure. The real question is what adjustments should be made to the official poverty measure. I'll just tick off some of the adjustments for which there's a very strong argument and which have a very profound effect on what the poverty numbers are. The first is whether to include non-cash transfers from the government. And needless to say, food stamps, now under the SNAP program, and health care entitlements, and the earned income tax credit and child welfare, the child tax credits and so forth. These are important additions to after-tax income that need to be taken account of. Second is the earned income tax credit, which is, of course, a government transfer, but it's an extremely important one for working families and makes a big difference in the level of poverty that they endure. If I can put in a personal plug, I wrote an article with Richard Zeckhauser, my economist friend, way back when I was a graduate student, arguing for the precursor of the earned income tax credit. And it is one of the most successful programs, if not the most successful program, apart from Social Security, that affect the lives of poor or near poor people. The Consumer Price Index overstates the cost of a constant standard of living. And so that is an adjustment that most analysts believe needs to be made. The census treats cohabiting couples differently than it treats married couples, and that also can make a difference in the result of the calculation. It does not take any account of regional differences in the standard of living. It doesn't take account of the fact that poverty for many people, for many poor people, is episodic. It doesn't continue throughout the year, but they have certain periods of poverty during the year. It doesn't take account of smaller household size since 1964. It doesn't take account of part-time workers who receive unemployment insurance for the periods of their unemployment, or many of the periods of their unemployment. It doesn't mention or take account of the refundable child tax credit. And then a very important factor is the reliance of the Census Bureau, not surprisingly, on the self-reporting of income and other elements of the calculation by the individuals in question. And some very important research has been done about whether those figures result from self-reporting are consistent with the actual disbursements that government agencies make to people who are eligible for these benefits. And there's a big, big difference. So that's a series of adjustments. Then there's a different conception of the appropriate measure of poverty, which is based on the consumption of goods and services by poor people. And Nicholas Eberstadt, who may be here, has done a lot of work on measuring the consumption changes over time, and they are very, very substantial in the right direction. So that the standard of living that poor people have today is much, much better than it was in 1964. Needless to say, I'm not saying that I would change places with people who are in this condition, but an objective analysis how many there are, what the trends are, what their prospects are, needs to be based on this kind of study. So if you look at housing, food, cars, appliances, healthcare, crime, and even obesity, the plight of people who are denominated poor in the official calculations is much better than it ever has been. Then there are subgroups of Americans whose poverty is especially concerning to us and ought to be especially concerning to us. The children. The child poverty rate is about 20% without these adjustments that I've mentioned before. If you enter those adjustments, it's down to about 15%, which is still a really appalling figure in a country as wealthy as ours. The elderly poverty rate is 9.8% without without the adjustment, and it's 2.6% with the adjustment. So you see, it's almost a quarter of what it would be under the official measure. And then a very interesting complication in the analysis of poverty is immigrants, because immigrants have an enormous increase in their well-being and their income measured in any way by reason of their coming to the United States, and yet many of them remain poor. And so one might question whether we should think of them in the same way that we think of Americans who are poor. As one analyst has put it, it's as if we absorbed a large population of the third world and didn't expect that to affect the poverty rate, but coupled with the realization that they actually have benefited enormously from coming to the United States. So that's a complication. Another feature of poverty analysis has to do with intergenerational mobility, on which the U.S. used to be a world leader and is now very much in the middle of the pack of OECD countries. And a very troubling statistic that I discuss in the book is that 40% of the grown sons born to fathers who are in the lowest quintile of income remain in the lowest quintile of income. So demography, as is often the case, is destiny. And if you're born to a father who was very poor, there's a very good chance that you, not a overwhelming chance, but a very good chance that you're going to be poor as well. Much of the discussion of poverty relates to blacks, and I discuss why that's the case and why much of this discussion can be very misleading. Their poverty rate is slightly lower than that of Native Americans and Alaskan natives. But the more important point is that more than 75% of blacks are not poor. So the kinds of generalizations and images that we form are unfortunately quite inaccurate, though it is the case that many too many blacks are born into poverty and will remain in poverty. The most important conclusion that I think analysts of poverty have come to in trying to determine what the trend is that today the class gap is even greater than the racial gap. That is to say, and this is a most unfortunate and deplorable condition, the best predictor of poverty is being born to unmarried mothers and absent fathers. That's the single best predictor. It's not race. It's not where you live. It's not even unemployment. It's the accident of birth. You know, there has been some good news in the poverty picture. The 2015 poverty rates declined sharply for all groups. Teenage pregnancy is down by over 50% since 1991. High school completion is up, with the black-white gap in high school completion closing. Not enough, but closing. It's now about 85%. Divorce rates have stabilized, though, of course, as we all know, at a very high level, much too high, I think, for the well-being of children. And crime has dropped in all communities over the last 20 years or so. So having measured and explained the measures and the adjustments and the statistical patterns of poverty, I next turn to the causes of poverty. And there are many, of course. The main proximate cause is, as has been emphasized by Brookings and AEI scholars, is underemployment and unemployment by working age, non-disabled family heads. What causes this underemployment and unemployment? Well, I go through a number of causes in some detail. The first, I would say, is bad luck. Now, how we define luck is, of course, a question that reasonable people can differ about, but some of it is, I think, bad luck, misfortune by any standards. Many poor people are poor because of a health problem that they could not really anticipate. Some are, especially women, are poor often because of divorces. Their standard of living declines something like 25% in the first year after divorce, whereas men's standard of living actually increases by about 10% in the first year after divorce. It's kind of a shocking comparison to me. 72% of babies, so that's bad luck. I have more to say about it, but I'll move on to family and community breakdown, which I consider the most important single cause of the under and unemployment by working age non-disabled family heads. 72% of black babies born out of wedlock today, that's triple the rate in 1965, triple the rate that it was when Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously decried the chaos and crisis of black families. And the white rate of babies born out of wedlock is now higher than the black rate was when Moynihan conducted his analysis in 1965. So it's an extraordinarily devastating development. And unfortunately, it's a development that we don't seem to know very much about solving. And it's not for want of study and effort. It's a really, really hard problem. A third cause of poverty is what is so-called disappearing jobs. And here, I have a lot to say. I discussed William Julius Wilson's analysis and some of the responses to his concerns about disappearing jobs. Very interesting finding, kind of shocked me, is how low a percentage of working age unemployed men cite as the reason for their unemployment lack of jobs. Now, some of these people are disabled, but when I come to discussion of disability, I'll have something more to say about that. A fourth possible cause, almost certainly a cause, is educational deficits. But here, it's important to emphasize what we often forget, which is that while we're blaming poor schools, we really ought to realize that, in fact, the deficits that exist in children's opportunities and achievement, academic achievement, begins well before they start in school. I'll have a bit more to say about that, including something about Jim Heckman's analysis of the problem. So I've talked about bad luck, family and community breakdown, disappearing jobs, educational deficits. A fifth is isolation. And here the sociologists have a lot to teach us. Many of you may be familiar with Mark Granovetter, who's a famous network sociologist, who's written about the strength of weak ties, by which he means the greater opportunities that are available to people who have a large network of weak ties instead of a small network of strong ties. So it's a kind of paradox, but it's easily explained. And Orlando Patterson has written about the myth of the hood. And just to summarize very quickly what these sociologists have reported is that black networks are both smaller and denser and have the smallest percentage of kinsmen of any other group. There's also very little outgroup marriage, especially for black women. So that isolation, which limits opportunities, limits information, limits contacts, is very severe. A sixth possible cause is discrimination. And here I distinguish between or among three different types of discrimination. One is intentional, a second is unintentional, and the third is statistical. And lawyers in the audience will certainly be very much aware of that distinction, which is reflected in doctrine under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. One complication is that the discrimination is prohibited against people on the basis of race, religion, national origin, gender, and so forth, but not on the basis of poverty. And so poverty is not a protected classification, which means that it can't be attacked with the normal, to the extent that discrimination is based on poverty, it can't be attacked in the normal fashion that civil rights law employs. A seventh cause of poverty is bad choices. Now here one can easily be accused of blaming the victim, but there are a range of choices that we can reasonably characterize as bad. Some of them are antisocial behaviors, and some of them are just short-sighted behaviors. So let me just read one description of this phenomenon. Most bad choices are simply short-sighted. They sacrifice the real possibility of future durable gains from more immediate but transitory ones. Common examples include chronic truancy, dropping out of high school, alcohol abuse, gambling, habitual indiscipline, ignoring schoolwork in favor of TV or video games, excessive borrowing and spending, domestic violence, parenting children whom one cannot afford or do not know how to care for, cultivating self-destructive habits and hanging out with antisocial people, and quitting jobs or training programs from which one could acquire useful skills or experience. The next cause is incarceration, and there's a lot of outcry about excessive incarceration in the country, and there should be, but the excess is less substantial than one might think. 62% of prisoners in the United States are violent or sex offenders. The states are, by and large, primarily, I think, for fiscal reasons, trying to empty the prisons of minor offenders. But that policy, which is a welcome policy, is only going to have a relatively marginal effect on the number of people in our prisons. And the last cause that I analyzed is the culture of poverty, by which I mean widespread, entrenched, self-reinforcing patterns of despair, of present orientation, or self-destructive conduct. And again, I discussed that a bit, but I don't want to say more about that now unless you want to raise it in the Q&A. I then discuss our current programs with an explicit focus on low-income people and communities. It's not that we haven't spent much money or even more money in recent years on these programs. In 2008, we spent $561 billion at the federal level. That was in 2008. Only 7 years later, we spent $848 billion on these programs. I go through the programs. I don't want to belabor it because there are other things to discuss, but SNAP, Earned Income Tax Credit, SNAP being the food stamp, what used to be called the food stamp program, the Earned Income Tax Credits, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. These are all very important and largely successful programs, though they have large amounts of fraud, waste, and abuse, and we don't seem to be able to reduce those measures or those amounts very significantly, if at all. These programs, some of these programs raise concerns about work incentives, particularly in SNAP and in Medicaid and in Social Security disability. I discussed the evidence on that. Another very important program is Title I with respect to education of the poor. It's been enforced for 52 years now. Brookings did a report on the effectiveness of Title I just a year and a half ago. It was quite critical of the effectiveness of the program on a variety of grounds, some of which are quite difficult to rectify, I think. Head Start, small program. Both Health and Human Services and the Brookings Institution have reported a rapid fade out of the benefits from Head Start by the third grade or even sooner, sometimes during the summer. Jim Heckman, a Nobel Prize winner in economics at Chicago, is more optimistic about the long-term effects of Head Start, but you know, when you're talking about the effects 30 years later, there's so many intervening conditions that it's hard to be really confident in that kind of analysis, but if Heckman says it, that there's probably a lot of truth to it. Job training programs, been little assessment, but the assessed ones show no effectiveness. The Job Corps today, after 50 years, it costs us about $1.8 billion a year, and every study that's been done, of which I'm aware, shows no effectiveness whatsoever. SSDI, Social Security Disability, Nick Eberstadt and others have studied this and shown that it contains serious moral hazard in reducing work incentives. The worker to disability insurance recipient, the ratio of workers to disability recipients has declined from 134 to 1 to 16 to 1. And some say it's actually close to 11 to 1. So that's a shocking development of which we need to take very seriously. Housing, there was a National Bureau of Economic Research comprehensive analysis in 2015. It found little evidence with respect to effects on poor people. Rod Chetty at Stanford has done some very important recent work showing that the number of years in better neighborhoods does affect long-term outcomes. So that's sort of encouraging and does have some policy implications that might be implemented. I then talk about policy reforms. The first possibility is to encourage macroeconomic growth. Problem there is we don't know how to do it without inflation, without bubbles, without international trade and currency effects. If we did, that would be probably the simplest way to do it. But macroeconomists are famed for the inaccuracy of their predictions. Second is redistribution directly to the poor. And here we have the example, a new example, though we don't have any evidence yet as to how it's working, the universal basic income plan that was adopted in Finland. But it's also been proposed by very prominent conservatives, Friedrich von Hayek, Milton Friedman, and Charles Murray. The design of these programs, of course, matters a lot. The political prospects for this were analyzed by Henry Aaron, who's a senior fellow at Brookings and a leading expert on poverty. He sees most Americans as, quote, commodity egalitarians. They will support programs that prevent poor people from going hungry, living in decrepit housing, or going untreated. But only a tiny minority are, quote, cash egalitarians, who support providing money to those without cash. Thus, and I'm quoting Aaron, we far more willingly vote refundable tax credits to pay for health care than we do refundable tax credits for low incomes. Besides, troublesome though administration of the health credits may be, it is child's play next to administering large transfers of cash. And I add that past experience supports this assessment. A third possibility is wage supplements, and there are a variety of ways to do this. The Earned Income Tax Credit does it already, and there's fairly widespread bipartisan support for increasing the Earned Income Tax Credit and extending it to groups of people who are not now eligible for it. Minimum wage, I think the evidence on the effects of minimum wage on entry-level employment and on automation is quite negative, which is one of the reasons why the Earned Income Tax Credit is a better way to go to increase effective after-tax wages. And wage insurance, which has been proposed by a number of people. It has not yet been instituted on a broad scale here, but that's a possible remedy. A fourth policy reform is enhancing human capital. That's largely done through the education system or through job training or job retraining. And I've already commented a bit on that, but I have much more to say in the book. Fifth policy reform would be to try to strengthen families. This, I believe, is the most important and also the most difficult. Brookings scholars Bell Sawhill and Ron Haskins have analyzed the success, what they call the success sequence, which is work, children only when they're married, marriage after 21, and finish high school. The same Henry Aaron, however, in a long footnote I have, is very skeptical that these approaches to the success sequence will be effective. And he's a strong advocate of remedies for poverty. A sixth policy reform I discuss is dismantling barriers to opportunity. This refers to some extent to work that was done and has been done for years and years, and most recently done by the Obama Council on Economic Advisors, which identified all sorts of occupational impediments to occupational mobility, licensing requirements that make no sense at all, and some other barriers of that kind. Residential mobility is another approach, and Section 8, the Section 8 program is our major weapon in that particular war. Again, the data on the effectiveness is somewhat mixed. A major study that was done in Chicago showed that actually the outcomes of people who moved with Section 8 vouchers to better neighborhoods were very mixed. And as I mentioned earlier, Raj Chetty, in a very recent analysis, believes that, well, maybe the ones who move younger and therefore spend more time in those better neighborhoods do much better. So the second, let's see how I'm doing on time here. Okay, I better hustle here. The second issue is immigration. I won't say much about that, although I say a hell of a lot in the book about it. It's one of the areas I've studied for a long time. I preface this by pointing to the political urgency of immigration reform. Henry Olson of AEI, formerly of AEI, has written a very important, I think, political analysis very recently, in which he argues that as a matter of electoral strategy, Democrats really have to get immigration policy right, and that means changing some time-honored positions on immigration. They can still be, as I certainly am, for expanded immigration and for honoring, if not cherishing, immigrants who come here and succeed. But it does require a different language and analysis. For one thing, for example, there will be no legalization, it seems to me, unless and until the public becomes convinced that the border is controlled. Now, in reality, the border will never be controlled, but the public needs to believe that the government is doing what it can to control the border and reducing the amount of illegal entry to a minimum. So those of us, and I suspect many of you join me in being strong advocates of legalization, need to attend to that. And that's partly what Henry Olson was discussing. I discuss comprehensive immigration reform, high-skill workers, agricultural workers, the number of green cards that we issue each year, the categories of those, Mexican quota, and a number of other issues. And for now, I'm just going to focus on three linked issues. The first being legalization, which I mentioned already. This would be of dreamers and of parents and others, and there's very, very strong arguments for this. Even Trump has seemed to recognize the strong claims that dreamers have to a reasonable policy of or prospect of legalization. These programs are hard to design, and if the conditions on legalization are too stringent, then the undocumented will not participate. They'll take their chances and continue in the shadows, as the cliche has it. And there are real problems of administration, particularly with a weak bureaucracy like ICE and the other immigration bureaucracies in the Health and Human Services. And there was widespread fraud in the 1986 legalization, especially with regard to the agricultural legalization program. Second big issue is enforcement. Here there are two venues that define the problem. The first is border enforcement. The second is in the interior. And most people don't understand that more than 50% of illegal immigrants entered legally. They're not people who crossed the border illegally. They entered legally and then they went out of status. And that has very important implications for the way in which the government can hope to enforce the immigration policies that it adopts. There are issues of detention, of immigration courts. I'm not going to dwell on those now. There are better techniques that we could use to improve enforcement. There's an important issue of employer sanctions, which have been kind of a joke up until now, and they can be strengthened, though of course there are important constraints on that. Universal identification card would help with enforcement. The civil liberties objections to this seem to me to be quite weak. They're strongly expressed, but I think they're very weak analytically. And then the third aspect of immigration that I discuss is integration. And trying to increase the naturalization rate, especially among Mexicans, perhaps through subsidies of naturalization fees, English language subsidies. The government should do much more in assisting immigrants to learn English, which, after all, is the most important weapon in making it an American, or resource in making it an American society. Better English as a Second Language programs, much of them have been not only have they failed, but they in some ways have made the matters worse. There's a lot of variation in ESL programs, so I don't want to overgeneralize. And the third issue, the last issue that I will discuss, and again very briefly, is religious exemptions from secular policies. Here the context is very complex. We have the conjunction of growing religious diversity with the growing secularism. We have a rights culture in which people are encouraged, I think, and even incentivized to claim a violation of their rights when they feel that their vital interests have been shortchanged. We also have a judicial methodology which is being developed as to how to arbitrate these claims between religious freedom and choice on the one hand and secular policies on the other. And the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was adopted at the federal level, and the Supreme Court held in a very important case that it only applied to the federal level, has led to about 20 or more states adopting state RFRAs, as they're called, which attempt to establish a legal standard by which these claims can be adjudicated, and puts a strong thumb, these state RFRA laws, puts a strong thumb on the side of the religious claimants. There are two key cases that I discuss in this chapter. One is the Hobby Lobby case, in which the RFRA was applied to exempt families, a family business and also a religious business, same company, from the ACA requirement concerning contraceptive coverage. And the real question is whether the courts will limit Hobby Lobby to a narrow set of facts, and it's really too early to tell about that. The second case is the Obergefell case, recognizing gay marriage as a constitutional right, which is a huge advance in human rights and equality for LGBTs, but it's galvanized strong religious-based opposition and demands for exemptions. It's a very complex situation because on the one hand we have the state RFRAs, which again strengthen the claims of religious minorities, and we have a lot of blue localities in red states and vice versa. Anti-discrimination laws cover different activities and different groups. We have economic boycotts, which so far have had some, in my view, excellent effects on the willingness of state politicians and local politicians to adopt restrictive laws, but that can cut both ways. We have a religious tax exemption issue, which is only now beginning to arise as to whether churches can lose their tax exemption if they take a strong stand against gay marriage. Of course, we have the issue of transgender use of facilities. I think bathrooms is a relatively tractable facility, but locker rooms is a much more complicated one. And I've argued in op-ed pieces that a lot of flexibility is needed in different communities to kind of grapple with these problems. It's a relatively new conflict. We haven't quite figured out how we feel about it in any sophisticated way, and we need more information about what the true trade-offs are in these situations. So I offer some principles for resolving these issues. The first thing to be said is that dignity, the claim of offense to dignity is it's really not a very helpful criterion for resolving these issues. Let me just read quickly. In many disputes, both sides could claim with equal force that a decision against them would morally stigmatize them. Grant that exemptions from baking same-sex wedding cakes tell gay couples that intimacy is central to their identity are immoral. What about denying the baker's claims? Won't that tell them, and traditional Muslims, Orthodox Jews, and Christians, that beliefs central to their identity are bigoted? If exemptions from performing abortions tar women who have had them, coercing pro-life doctors must brand them enemies of women's equality. On most serious issues, any side might feel deeply stigmatized by rival actions or policies. So having despaired of using the claims about dignity as a way of resolving these disputes. I then move on to choice, and the more choice we can afford people, the less these conflicts are going to fester. But the choice strategy often begs questions of coercion and of harm. In school prayer settings or football prayers at football games, there's a question as to whether young people feel coerced when these invocations are made, and whether they're harmed if they have to or choose to remain silent during them. A third approach, another approach rather, is the distinction between conduct and status. Compelling one to act against one's conscience is different than having to accept another's status, and I think that can resolve some of these disputes. Another approach is one that's familiar to constitutional lawyers, and it's embodied in the RFRA statute, and that is the least restrictive alternative. Whatever restrictions there are on religious exercises in pursuit of secular policies, those restrictions ought to be as unrestrictive as they can be while still accomplishing the secular objective. Another approach, which I think is very important, is to decentralize accommodation when both sides have reasonable and deep disagreements concerning what liberty and dignity and equal respect require, and no principled way to resolve them. Another principle is the de minimis principle. This is adopted from nuisance law, for those of you who've studied torts. And an example is the Zubik case, which the Supreme Court has sent back, hoping for informal resolution, in which the government merely required religious groups to file a form in order to get an exemption. And some complain that that's a burden on their exercise of their religious freedom, and I say I would consider that de minimis. That's a de minimis burden that we ought to be able to impose on people in order to further social solidarity in such situations. Another approach, an interesting one, advanced by Andrew Koppelman, a law professor, who would allow and encourage businesses to publicly state their moral objections to a particular practice, such as gay marriage, without incurring liability for a hostile environment. And he argues that this would encourage both separation of people in different who have different feelings and approaches to these issues, and dialogue between them. And finally, and most obviously, but also most difficult to put together, is compromise. In the Zubik case, as I suggested, the Supreme Court has really recently remanded that case in hopes of a negotiated compromise. The state of Utah expanded civil rights protection for LGBTs while protecting religious objectors, allowing recusals by state officials who would otherwise have to perform certain ceremonies rather, and so forth. So in closing, I have a few parting thoughts. I think my analysis of hard issues teaches that reasonable people who care deeply about the public interest as they understand it can and do disagree about how to define, approach, and resolve them. And three important implications follow from this. The first is that elements of clear thinking can be applied to any hard issue, not just the ones that I've focused on in this book. Second, if advocates of one or another position can acknowledge the empirical and normative complexities that make such issues hard, then they may come to see their opponents' arguments as at least plausible and thus worthy of respect, which may in turn cool and elevate the debate enough to encourage search for common ground. And then finally, even when this open-minded analysis can't resolve hard issues, it can narrow the range of disagreement, which in turn can facilitate compromise. The only alternative, it seems to me, is some form of coercion that threatens the perceived legitimacy of victors and leaves the defeated bitter, vengeful, and determined to undermine them in their policies. And my question is, does this sound familiar? To me, it does. Thank you very much for listening. Yeah.
Peter, thank you for that very thoughtful lecture, for walking us through just an enormous amount of complex material in a very short period of time. Now it's time to turn to your questions, and if you could identify yourselves and wait for a microphone. We have people with mics on both sides, and we'll start with a question from the front. If you could wait for the mic, Joel.
Joel Zinberg. I'm a visiting scholar here at AEI and a long-term friend of our speaker. Peter, you've written in the past about American exceptionalism. Is there something, do you think, that's unique about hard problems to the United States? Do we have more of them? They're more vexing, more common? Is there something unique about the way we approach them? Are we more or less likely to engage in clear thinking about them? And are they more intractable here than they are elsewhere? And if so, why?
Yeah. I think it is. I think we are exceptional in this respect. Not by exceptional, I just mean as a matter of degree. We are more polarized on these issues, I think, than in other liberal democracies. And there are a couple of reasons for this, which I alluded to at the outset. One is that we live in what's been called properly, I think, a rights culture, in which people whose interests are being threatened tend to claim those interests not merely as interests, but as rights. And we have a jurisprudence that invites people to make those sorts of claims, and the courts sometimes succumb to the temptation to recognize strongly felt and substantial interests as rights. So that's one thing, and the nature of our jurisprudence, the constitutional structure in which we operate, I think it tends to encourage that. We also live in an adversarial system, which sociologist Bob Kagan has written a book called, very good book called Adversarial Justice, in which he explains how so many disputes that ordinarily would not be, and in other countries would not be adjudicated in the courts, come to court. And there are a lot of reasons for this. A lot of for one thing, our system of attorney's fees, our contingency fee system, leads to a lot more entrepreneurial lawyering than in other countries, where the loser of the decision pays the fees. But there are quite a few reasons for this. I think we're also a much more difficult society to govern today than we were in the past, and that has a number of reasons. One is that we're far better educated than we were, and we no longer admire those who were previously in authority in quite the same way that we did before, and that's true, in connection with the religious authority and institutional authority in universities and elsewhere, and of course in political authority as well. So we're much more unruly people than we were. In that respect, we're less unruly, I think, in some other respects than we have been at times in the past.
Yes. Question right here in the front, and then we'll move over here.
Thank you, Larry Checo, Checo Communications. I think my question might be also on that iPad there. But you've spoken a lot about poverty, and there's an old saying in this town that show me your budget and I'll tell you your values. What values does Mr. Trump's proposed budget, especially as they relate to the poor, tell us about our values?
Well, that's a very easy question, I think. I'm perhaps going to sound unduly partisan. Actually, I called myself a militant moderate, and I am really not a partisan at all. But I think Trump has proved his incompetence to be president in any number of ways, and I think this budget certainly reflects the fact that he really doesn't, I don't think he gives a damn about poor people. And he's making some hard choices, as is always made in budgets, to emphasize expenditures that he considers much more important. So I think that's very clear. But in a way, it's too easy, because putting Trump aside, and I would love to put Trump aside as a never Trump person, I think the issues that I've outlined surrounding poverty are really, really hard ones. And the lack of effectiveness of many, not all, but many of our poverty programs demonstrate that even those who have a strong commitment to eradicating poverty have not been terribly successful, although, again, EITC is a very good program, and Social Security has essentially eliminated elder poverty, and we've made some real advances. So I don't want to. I think it's a cop out to just blame it all on Trump and his minions. Those of us who have a deep commitment to reducing or eliminating poverty have to come up with better solutions, and they're very elusive. The UBI is very tempting, because one virtue that it would have is to cash out all or many of the programs that now purport to help the poor, cash them out and write a check to people and eliminate all the bureaucracy and regulation that is now in place to draw these very fine distinctions and make these very difficult decisions. But as Henry Aaron emphasized in the passage that I read, that's very unlikely to happen, and it's not clear to me that that would be an altogether good thing. I think one does have to worry about work incentives, and I don't think it's the case that just because we have a low unemployment rate today, everybody who could be employed is employed. That's certainly not the case. We have a very, very low, historically low labor force participation rate, which is in some ways inexplicable. One answer is that people are aging. It was a demographic phenomenon, but that can't begin to explain what we're observing in the reduced labor force participation. And the way in which we define unemployment and underemployment also, I think, obscures a lot of Americans who could work and are not working. We don't really know why.
You anticipated the very first question from our online audience about what is your opinion of the universal basic income. So we've answered that, and we can move on. Now let's go right here. I think you had a question in the front. And please identify yourself.
Yes, my name is Todd Wiggins, proud resident of District of Columbia. Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask you if you feel that the conclusions that you've come to are dramatically different from any of your peers. What is your competitive advantage for this book, so to speak? And then secondly, do you believe our two-party system, which I think instills what you refer to as adversarial justice as we see it manifesting itself these days, is it the best system to achieve the ideals that you've described?
Well, the first question is fairly easy to answer. The second is almost impossible to answer, I think, in any reasonable period of time. My comparative advantage is basically that I read a lot of social science in all of these areas because I care a lot about understanding the facts, the basic facts in the situation. And I am, I think, a clear thinker, and I have a genuine commitment to helping more people to think clearly about these issues. I'm certainly not the only person in the country or even in Washington, D.C. who has these attributes. Some of them are sitting in the audience. Jonathan Rauch is a good example, but there are others as well. So no, I just have gone to the trouble to tell a very complex set of stories about public policies that I think other people could have written, but they haven't.
Question,
As far as the
question.
second question, the political system, I don't know. It's enormously complicated question. I think we have an admirable political system, all things considered, but it does have its disadvantages. And the election of Trump, in my view, has caused me to rethink some of the confidence that I had in our political system. But I also think that this is probably Pollyannish on my part, but I also think that our system has an enormous amount of resilience and will respond to this challenge in a positive way. Of course, I don't know how long that will take, but I think it will happen. I think it's already beginning to happen, so there's some reason to be confident in the long-term trajectory of the United States, though I despair as much as anybody in this room about the short-term one. One other thing about our political system is that the politicians can screw things up a lot, and often do. But our system depends to an enormous extent, compared with other societies, on the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and private activity. And so although, as I say, the government can screw things up pretty badly, it can't screw things up as much as can happen in other countries where the 65% of the GDP runs through the government.
A question in the middle right here.
My name is Carl Bartholomew. Peter, your discussion of poverty, you mentioned, I think, about 9 different approaches which have varying degrees of effectiveness in terms of producing results. And that's what the data shows. However, when policymakers consider how to allocate resources among those 9, their decisions frequently represent their values as opposed to a pragmatic decision about what works. Have you considered allowing the states to be laboratories for experimentation and rewarding those states that pick the more effective solutions? For example, by decreasing the tax rate of individuals who live in states which have demonstrated more progress in terms of reducing poverty.
Well, yes, I have given this a lot of thought. This is not a novel suggestion, and to some extent we've tried to do that. The No Child Left Behind was an example of that. It ran into big problems because, among other things, and according to the folks on the ground with educational policy, the feds tended to overregulate situations in ways that led to bad outcomes. I can't really assess that claim. But the idea that states as little laboratories, as Justice Brandeis called them, is absolutely crucial. And one of the things that I argue for in this and in other books is more controlled experiments, which our federal system actually facilitates because there is so much diversity. And so the welfare reform, which of 1996, which I consider a big success, although not a complete success, was created after a good deal of experimentation by states, which produced a lot of data suggesting that a better approach could be adopted. Now, it ran into trouble during the Great Recession, and even during the recession in the early 2000s. But the data that I've seen, much of which comes from Brookings, and also Bob Doerr's work here at AEI, convinces me that poor people are better off, on the whole, better off today, and that child poverty has declined compared to what it was in 1996. So yes, I'm very much in favor of that approach, but it has to be done carefully, and the data gathering has to be rigorous.
Is there a question over here on this side of the room? The microphone is coming. Right there.
Hi, Ian Mason, Breitbart News. I wanted to ask you about birthright citizenship.
Yeah.
So in Citizenship Without Consent, you had suggested it was a possibility of ending the policy. Now that there's the first president suggesting the same, have your views on the subject changed?
It's a very perceptive question, I should say, but an utterly fair one. In Citizenship Without Consent, for the 99.9% of you who've never read this book, Roger Smith, the political scientist now at Penn, and I wrote a book examining the legislative and constitutional history of our tradition of birthright citizenship, and we concluded, I think, very persuasively that birthright citizenship is not constitutionally required, though it is constitutionally permitted, and that Congress, if it wished to, could adopt a different rule than the outright birthright citizenship that's automatic across the board for anybody who's born in the United States, regardless of how they entered, for how long they stay, whether they remain in the country or they don't remain in the country, and whether they're tourists or what have you. I think there are strong arguments against that rule, but I think there are also some pretty weighty arguments in favor of the traditional rule. And so we didn't take a position in Citizenship Without Consent except to argue that it was possible, that Congress has the constitutional authority to regulate birthright citizenship in a way that had been previously denied by most people who discuss the matter. As to where I stand now, and as to what the Trump administration will do on this, I've been a little surprised that I haven't heard more about birthright citizenship from the Trump administration. I would have thought that this would be high on their agenda, and if that's high on their agenda, then for me that's a strong, though not necessarily dispositive argument that I'm not in favor of it. But you know, I think I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times several years ago about this controversy, and I argued that there are intermediate solutions that I think would better serve the competing values and interests in this on this issue. And one is to give birthright citizenship to all people who are born in the United States and reside in the United States for a certain period of time and are educated in the United States for a certain period of time. I don't know what the number would be, whether it be 10 years old and 5 years of school or whatever smarter people than I might conclude. But I think that's a supportable reform, and I believe in that.
We have one question over here, and then we'll go to the back, and I'm afraid that's going to have to be the last question.
Hi, Pat Span.
Could you identify yourself? I'm sorry.
Oh, Pat Span.
Okay.
I was noticing one of your items was affirmative action, and having spent over 32 years in the federal government on obviously the wrong side of affirmative action, I was wondering if you thought that affirmative action was finally going to waste away and disappear.
No. I don't think it will. I don't think the proponents of affirmative action have any intention to or incentive to eliminate affirmative action, since it will always be arguable and to a certain extent will be true that different groups are not equal in our society. And so I don't think the proponents will ever willingly give it up. And the American public, as I show in the book, has been opposed to affirmative action, by which I mean ethno-racial preferences, not non-discrimination. I've been against it by majorities, clear majorities, for a long time, and so including most minority groups. So I think it's probably here to stay. It doesn't depend that much on law. It depends more on the policies of public universities and private universities who are only indirectly affected by federal law. So they could end it, but they won't.
Before turning to our last questioner in the back, I'll remind you that Peter's book is for sale, and you can bring the copies in, and he will be signing them. And for those of you who didn't have a chance to ask your question, Peter will also be here to answer those questions. The gentleman in the back.
Gideon Sanford, I'm a small business owner. You mentioned the earned income credit as an idea with broad bipartisan support for fighting poverty. It was included in the Better Way, Paul Ryan's plan. The Brookings AEI anti-poverty report had it expanded earned income credit for childless adults. What do you think are the obstacles that have kept that functional working program from being expanded, given the level of supposed bipartisan support that it has?
Well, I think there's always political opposition to moving too far into the middle class with subsidies of that kind, and that's why there's a phase out which causes a cliff, an incentive cliff, in which if you earn another dollar, you're out of the program. They've tried to phase that trajectory in a gradual way, but ultimately it has to be phased out at some point. So I think that's one reason. I don't know. I think that's the main policy concern about it. There's also a lot of fraud in the program, but I think something 20 to 25% of the applications for earned income tax credit turn out to be improper. It's not all fraudulent. And one of the problems with federal programs, and that accounts for a lot of what we call fraud, waste, and abuse, is because these programs are so very complicated, involving so much paperwork, that it's fairly easy to make a mistake. So I don't know if it's fraudulent, but that's one of the reasons. Just let me say one more thing about affirmative action very quickly. I am very much in favor of socioeconomic affirmative action. And there are a number of people, Richard Collenberg particularly has written widely on this possibility. I discussed this in the book, and I've discussed it in previous books. That's not a terribly easy program to design, but I think it would be better than the ethno-racial preferences. And there'd be a lot of overlap in terms of the beneficiaries of the program, but not complete overlap. And so affirmative action produces more numbers for ethno-racial groups than a socioeconomic one would, because a lot of poor whites would qualify for that.
Please join me in thanking Peter for a wonderful lecture. And buy the book.